This is Jim from Portage M&A Advisory, and you're listening to the Selling Successfully podcast, the show that simplifies selling your business for those thinking about moving into the next chapter of life. If you like what you hear, please follow or subscribe to find us easily and listen again. We're here when you need us. Today, I'm thrilled to have Bhavna Duggal with me today, Principal CFO at the CFO Center. Thanks for joining me, Bhavna.
Thanks for having me over, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm a big fan of what you and Portage do, so thank you for having me over.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. In this episode, we've got some really interesting things to talk about. I know we were talking recently just about interim CFOs, talking about fractional CFOs,
yes.
The differences between those, and really the importance of those roles, how they fit into business ownership, and especially with economic headwinds, M&A, there's a huge place for the things that you do. So excited to jump into that.
Excited to be talking a little bit about myself today, but a lot more about how, to your point, the finance profession is evolving. So thank you, Jim.
Right. So let's kick it off. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell me a little bit about what you do at the CFO Center.
Well, that's always a very interesting question to ask, and it all depends on where you are in your career journey, right, Jim? So I like to start off by saying I'm an accountant, unfortunately, not once, but twice over, and not by design, but by default. Definitely an engineer at heart.
Yeah.
I love problem solving, getting in as a SWAT team, trying to figure out how can we solutionize for better finance, and how can we take finance to the next stage and the next level of evolution. So it's a trusted business partner,
right,
not just to the organization, but to all stakeholders involved for the business, for the entity. And one of the most interesting ways of doing this is an interim or a fractional CFO. And the funny thing is, if you had asked me this maybe 2 years ago, what is a fractional CFO? Honest to God, I had no idea. So I literally just stumbled into this through a fantastic organization called the CFO Center of Canada. It's an outfit which is 100 CFOs coast to coast, from the west coast to the east coast of Canada. And we also work with organizations in the US, on the east coast of the US. What do? A bunch of very highly skilled, tenured finance leaders across all industries and sectors that are helping startups, or seasoned companies, or second, third generation family businesses advance their business model and help them grow and scale up or exit, depending upon whatever their end goal is, through the lens of a seasoned warrior. Now, I like to call myself the accounting warrior, and that's what I do. Just a little bit more flavor on the difference between a fractional CFO and an interim CFO, right? I mean, a full-time CFO is someone who's working full-time for an organization, but given the current economic environment, given the post-pandemic revival of the Canadian economy, and to a large extent the US economy, Jim, and you know this, you have a pulse on this a lot more than some of us do, right? Cost minimization, managing liquidity is on top of mind for a lot of businesses, and they really can't afford a full-time CFO and a full-time CFO package.
Right.
But they do want the financial acumen, the business to grow. They want the direction and the strategic finance leadership to say, this is how your cash looks like in the next 24 to 36 months. This is how your profits will look like. These are the KPIs and KRIs to which your business should be benchmarking itself to grow. Or this is how you manage stakeholders, other shareholders, investors. This is how you get funding. Or this is how you exit, because this is it. You've had it. You want to hang your boots and you want to go travel the world now, but you want to exit your business in the right way, right? Or you want to plan for succession the right way. So a fractional CFO is a part-time CFO. That means I come in once or maybe twice a week. And in that once or twice a week, I'm giving 120% of my attention to whatever is top of mind to the organization. And what that means is I typically end up having, like any other fractional CFO, a roster of 2, 3, maybe 4 clients going at the same point in time. An interim CFO, on the other hand, is someone that is doing a full-time role with only one client, but for a very limited, short span of time. And that's because they're filling the boots for someone else who's either gone on a leave or a sabbatical, or before a new permanent, role is filled, the organization wants to test the waters with someone at an interim level. The expertise, the level of advice, the financial leadership is going to be the same. It's just how much time are you giving?
Right.
And 2 years ago, this wasn't a big deal. But the pandemic changed everything. And now that work can be done remotely, this is in favor for any interim or fractional CFO.
So, Bhavna, let's talk a little bit about how fractional CFOs, interim CFOs have come about. I mean, I think typically we see this. Most of the stuff's coming from the US and eventually lands in Canada. It's becoming quite common in Canada. We're seeing it, from banks, requests for reporting, additional, assurance, when it comes to risk.
Yes.
What exactly is the driving force behind interim CFOs, fractional CFOs?
So, Jim, that's a fantastic question. And I think it's multiple different variables playing into why fractional CFOs and interim CFOs are seeing such a resurgence right now, right? It's not only in the US, but also in Canada, to your point, where the timing of why this is happening is important. There's a lot of M&A activity, which is happening both north and south of the border.
Yep.
You and I were talking about this the other day, and there are a lot of baby boomers that are retiring and thinking of succession planning. I know personally of a lot of businesses, and you probably have a better pulse on this, where they're struggling with liquidity or funding issues. And to your point, there are banks that are now getting involved to say, if organizations in the small and medium sector of the industries, no matter which industry you're coming from, right, don't have a seasoned finance leadership, then how do the banks get the comfort that the underlying financial information that's coming to them is complete and accurate? It doesn't necessarily need to be audited, but there are covenants that need to be met. And in certain conditions, the banks require that clarity, that level of control, that foresight, which they know that if a seasoned accounting, CPA, qualified finance leader is bringing in, then they know that they can have trust behind those numbers, even if they're not audited or reviewed, right? So, the US has seen the fractional CFO business, if I can call it that, exist for at least a decade.
Right.
And it was well and thriving before the pandemic. In Canada, however, because we are smaller, we are a lot more closed, but very much integrated also at the same time. Closed because we only tend to deal with the US, and integrated because when we deal with the US, we seem to be very well integrated with the US. So it's just natural that whatever's happening in the US would have a follow-on impact in Canada. So fractional CFOs in the last, I would say, maybe 2 to 3 years have gained traction because it's an attractive cost proposition to the business as well, right?
Yeah. And that resonates with me because I think, the size of businesses oftentimes that we deal with, it's not cost effective to bring in a seasoned CFO that they would really need, right?
Yeah.
Oftentimes I see them looking at a full-time, let's call them controller or glorified bookkeeper. That's not cutting it for the banks, right? They're looking for I think more sophistication. Even for the business owners, oftentimes they're looking for cash forecast, or they're looking for some strategic guidance. And I can completely understand how the role of a fractional CFO would make a lot of sense, especially if they're looking at selling, right? Just preparing the business to make sure that everything is in order.
Those are some really amazing points you bring up, especially around financial leadership for cash flow management, liquidity management. A lot of the businesses, even though they've been successful and they would have been multi-generational, they just don't think from a data perspective, Jim.
Right.
And you and I are data people, right?
Yeah.
You're looking at historical data to project what's going to happen in the future.
Right.
Build that cash flow scenario, do a profit and loss forecasting scenario, and understanding where the potential is for the business to grow, and then going back and explaining to the owners, the entrepreneurs, or just, you know, that second, third generation of family owners to say, your business actually needs to grow in this direction. So a fractional CFO is different from a controller and a bookkeeper, and that's where the essence of that difference lies. You know, a bookkeeper, very important role.
Yep.
Is, you know, retrospectively looking at all that information that is critical to the business, but might not have the capability to give that forward-looking financial foresight, or think through relationships, help the business grow, or look for that strategic funding. And that's where a seasoned finance leader who's been in those situations, has led different companies at different points in time during their career through that journey, and now bringing that expertise. So it's a big industry expertise to a very small business, right? And it actually works in the fractional CFO model. And I really like how you phrased it. The banks are keen to see that they're bringing in people who understand the covenants that are outlined in that, you know, line of credit that has been extended, or that fixed loan that has been given. Pre-pandemic, when the interest rates were low, everyone was getting free money. Now cash is expensive. I find it very contradictory to say that. It's like a double pun. Cash is expensive, but that's the reality where we are, right? I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and again, from an M&A perspective, I think, especially when we're dealing with business owners who are looking to sell, the piece that I think is really critical is getting them to think about, what is the buyer going to face when they're acquiring? What questions are they going to ask, right? That is really where the strategic component comes in, right? Oftentimes our sellers have no debt. They've got unaudited financials. The bank isn't pestering them. They've got no significant loans. They're sitting on cash. There's no issues typically with anything in the business. Things are rolling along nicely. And so they have a hard time really understanding what the challenge would be for a buyer. But you know, what sellers often don't realize is that the buyer's coming to the table. They're going to be using a significant amount of debt, putting their equity in there, oftentimes convincing other stakeholders, investors, to put their hard-earned money in there. They want to know that they're buying something that, you know, is fair market value, is going to hold the test of time, and is going to provide a good return. And that's oftentimes where I see the disconnect from the seller and the buyer. And you know, when we get involved and the seller brings us to the table, this is an education piece that we're working on. And oftentimes what we're digging into are the things they never thought about. Customer concentration. Are there any supplier risks? Is there a management team that's going to transition? Does it make sense to buy the shares versus the assets? All those things are going to be critical to a buyer. And that's really where I see, you know, a strategic-minded CFO, interim CFO, or even fractional CFO coming in and saying, let's prepare this thing so we can maximize the value. But that's the piece oftentimes that is missed. What we typically will see, or you know, the situation that's presented to us is there's the accountant, there's the business owner, perhaps a bookkeeper, but that other element isn't in place, and there's no runway left to really optimize.
I have so many, I'm going to not use the word horror stories, but I have no choice but to say that, where everything that you've just said right now, Jim, is an actual reality, right? So this is your world that you're living in. This happens to be, unfortunately, my world as well, where businesses are small, or businesses have been very successful, and they might be large as well. They may or may not have a bookkeeper that may or may not be doing the right level of accounting, because there's not a lot of debt on the books. The bank is not pushing them to get that reviewed or audited set of financials out. Everything is hunky-dory till a seller walks in, right? Till a proper succession plan is built out. And even then, bookkeepers or the tax accountant might be able to give one view of what that succession plan needs to look like. But a lot of the times, a M&A firm is not even involved in these conversations. And that's where a strategic finance leader, like a seasoned CFO, fractional or interim, doesn't matter, would walk in and say, Are we making sure that this is fair market value? And are we keeping our eyes open and being very transparent, even with the buyer, to say, are they really cognizant of what they're actually walking into? And how are you giving the message to the employees? What's really going to happen to them once this transaction is over? And that's where an organization like yours, Portage, comes in and helps elevate the dialogue to a completely different level. It's an education piece, but it's also a financial win-win for both the buyer and the seller, right? Yeah. And you could be representing the buyer, you could be representing the seller. For the bank, knowing that you're in there, knowing that there's a seasoned CFO in there, the bank can put their hands up and say, we're going to sit around and just watch this match happen and just walk in later when the funding is required, or the restructuring of that capital required to buy out or exit this business is required, right?
So Bhavna, I think, I really like this discussion. I really like, us getting into some examples of what we're seeing. But let's talk a little bit about economic headwinds, because I think that's a big part of what's driving this increased compliance environment, interim CFOs, and the rest of it. Let's talk about some of the challenges that you're seeing, and I think a lot of this has stemmed from the pandemic. Yes. Let's talk a little bit about interest rates. Let's talk a little bit about other challenges business owners are facing.
Let me start off with a very important disclaimer. I am not an economist, and they're not my friends. No, I'm just kidding. But the environment that we're living in right now, Jim, you're absolutely right. It's economic headwinds. It's a challenging environment for businesses that survived the pandemic. A lot of them did that because they inherently had a strong cash flow backing them. Right? And whether it was pure luck or whether it was by design, they survived. And the ones that didn't survive, there was a lot of cleanup required. For the ones that survived, they're now dealing with a complete reversal of what they saw during the pandemic. It's no longer a low interest rate environment. Funding and cash isn't coming that easy. It is hard to find buyers and investors that might be interested in the business. And given the geopolitical risks that we're living in right now, there are about 24 different countries in the world that are going to have different leaders and going to go through elections before the year's over. So very different geopolitical landscape at the end of the day. Even if you're a small Canadian business or you have big global ambitions, all of that has an impact, right? And one of the examples that I want to walk you through is, one of my current clients, which is in the furniture reselling business. They're not furniture, suppliers or manufacturers, but they do resell. So they have suppliers overseas, and then they resell to some of the bigger brands here in Canada. And now they've opened up in the US. So the current owner bought the existing business about 2 years ago, and it's a 40-year-old business. They did not have an M&A firm advising them, so they ended up paying more than they should have for the business. Turns out that they did their own due diligence, and they thought they were getting the right inventory. They thought they were getting the right customer lists. They thought they were getting the right valuation in the door. A year later, and they did this without a CFO also, might I add. Wow. A year later, none of that is relevant anymore. The funding that they have from the banks isn't strong enough to keep the business going. Now they're looking for alternative funding, but they can't get any of that because they had no cash flow forecast projections. They did not forecast their P&L. They didn't know what their alternative routes were to getting in maybe additional investors in the road, interested in the business. So one of the first things I had to do was roll up my sleeves and let the company's numbers look better. And the only way you can do that is where you plan for the future and you plan for the best case scenario, base template, and you know this, Jim, and then a potential worst case scenario. And then you've built out 3 different business models, and then you're catering to which one do you think has the highest probability of working. It was a level of sophistication that the business owner was not used to. And I'll admit, we had to go baby steps. But if we could dial back, the clock, it would have been amazing to have an M&A firm in there that would have actually helped them with the initial purchase of this business, help them get the right level of funding, and then have a seasoned CFO that came in and said, if this is where you're starting off from, how do we take you to that X multiple in the future, given the current economic environment that you're in, right? So, it's every day is a great joy because every day there's a new problem and a new fire to douse. But this is exactly what keeps a fractional CFO on their toes, right? Because every day is a new day with a new problem. And we literally don't know how the economy will pivot in the next couple of quarters. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that, or any other examples that you would have to share.
I like this example for a few different reasons. If I think about the buyer and the vulnerability that they now face, if there's one thing that's changed since the pandemic, I would say the word I would use is uncertainty. Oh, yeah. And things change so quickly. Yeah. And from a lender's perspective, and you're probably seeing this now with people move to special loans, there is limited flexibility in forgiveness. Oh, yeah. And if they're not, buyers in particular, if they're making acquisitions, if they're not attached to the right bank, and they have a good relationship with their banker, they can be at risk, right? Yes. And so, as you know, when we go through the M&A process, we want to make sure the buyer is well-funded, there's a plan in place to protect them, at least there's some sort of forecast for the next 3 to 5 years. Yes. We understand the covenants, we understand the buffer within the covenants. The bank is usually asking us, hey, who's the CFO who's going to be managing the covenants alongside the accounting firm? Yeah. And they're trying to mitigate the risk on their investment. This is an example where I think a buyer was probably very entrepreneurial. Yes. They said, listen, we can do this alone. What is the true risk? We understand the industry. Yep. But I think what gets overlooked in these situations is that there are best practices that most business owners would not be aware of in the M&A world, in the CFO world, where you're navigating relationships with the bank, you're trying to understand the impact of your financial statements if the economy changes, interest rates, a prime example of a driver that's changed. And now you're caught with your pants down and you're trying to figure out what to do. And that's the situation you don't want to come into, where your options are limited and the bank has already put you up against the wall, said, make this work. Well, like, it's a tough situation for you.
It is. That's actually one of my other clients at the moment. But you're spot on. It's bullseye, Jim. You have your finger on the pulse here. Yeah. There are a lot of companies that are facing being in that special loans category with a number of different banks, and let's call a spade a spade. The Canadian banks are a conservative lot. Yeah. They're not as risk conducive as the American banking system would be. But then again, the American banking system has its own issues with regional banks folding over. What happened a year ago with SVB, Signature Bank, and that continues into a lot of other regional banks. Very different banking landscapes, but because the Canadian construct is so conservative, if you just read the next quarter's provisions for bad loans that all the big banks in Canada have done, they're projecting at least, $3 to $5 billion of losses in just the next quarter. And that's a big hit on the size of the GDP that we do have in Canada, right? So the headwinds aren't that great. But having in a seasoned finance leader, and I'm going to reiterate that again, a seasoned M&A firm, you don't really need to be in a transaction mode right now. You can be planning for that next stage. Planning is all in the details, right? How much more can you plan now for whatever exit that you're looking for a year, 5 years, maybe even 10 years from now, right? It's never too early to have those conversations. I guess if you had to step in and do my job, you'd do it in a heartbeat because you just lived my life by giving me all those examples. But this is where professionals like ourselves are so much more needed to help elevate the level of awareness, understanding, but also how businesses can actually win. Right. And we're truly here to make those businesses win, right? Not every business is going to knock it out of the park, but for those businesses that are just surviving, How can we make them thrive better? It's a tough environment.
Yeah, and you made an interesting point about the banking environment and how things are getting tougher and tougher, even on the lending side, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to protect their investment. They don't want to see bad loans, right? They're pulling back in vulnerable industries. They're pulling back. Typically what we see is in the lower middle market, they're the first to get hammered with these sorts of things, right?
100%.
So usually, what we tend to hear is step one is they're asking more and more reporting from the business owner.
Yes.
Prove to us that you're in good shape. Prove to us that there's nothing funky going on that we need to be worried about.
Yeah.
Step two, we're really concerned about this industry. We may not want to have our money out there, and we may call our loan. Do you see situations like this right now?
What an amazing question to ask, Jim, because I do have a real life example of a current organization that is, unfortunately battling the special loans category that the series of banks that have syndicated together to give it a loan have put it in. But I didn't know that there was another level, that could take you further down. And they're now dealing with a situation where they've gotten a tolerance letter from the series of banks that have funded them saying, you're on a watch list. We know you've been struggling for the past few months with your liquidity and managing all the covenants that are coming with the funding that the banks have provided.
Right.
We are now going to amplify the reporting, amplify our conversations with you, amplify our monitoring of you, have more hand-holding. There are more communication channels. They want a lot more transparency, even if it's just a verbal dialogue. They want to know what the inventory is looking like. Where is that next shipment coming from? What is your customer list looking like? Where all do you think you're going to expand? They're getting a lot more embedded in the business model. And having a fractional CFO or an interim CFO that can deflect those questions, manage those questions, know when pushback is required versus when you really need to go with the bank here and answer all those questions. And then one of the first things that I'm trying to do is find a path to how do I get this business outside of that special loans category. So it's a conversation that typically an entrepreneur or business owner wouldn't think of having, because you're on the receiving end of news from your bank. Your bank is spending and bankrolling you. So you're just waiting for the bank. You're being reactive and waiting for the bank to tell you what needs to be done. But a seasoned finance leader would come in and say, what is the path to getting out of here? What is it that we need to do? You've given us what we don't need to do, but what is it that we need to do, and what is that timeline? Tell me, is it the next 3 months? Is it the next 6 months? How is it the next 1 year? And then the seasoned finance professional is holding the bank accountable to say, we had that conversation a few months ago. We've delivered on everything that you've asked us to. Don't drop us off your radar. We need to get out of this.
Right. Yeah, and I imagine, if you think about the business owner, there's probably sleepless nights.
Oh, yeah.
And
100%.
this is not something they're familiar with.
No.
And I mean, no different than the M&A process. What we tell them is, listen, we'll manage the M&A process. We've got this. You manage your business. You keep doing what you're good at.
Yeah.
You're coming in and you're doing what you're good at, and you can deal with the banks. But I agree. There is a process, and there's protocol, and there needs to be a plan. And you got to get that business owner sleeping so they can manage their business.
100%.
So let's pivot to kind of a more positive type topic. Let's talk about putting the success into succession and planning for the exit of a business and how you can plug in and really help an owner maximize the value of their business. And I know we were talking off script a few moments about this and how, there's lots of data, but at the end of the day, there's a secret sauce in understanding the data and understanding what's driving the business in order to really reap that true value.
Yeah. I firstly have to commend you and your marketing team for such an amazing wordplay here.
You like that?
I love it.
Yeah.
Success
It wasn't me.
in succession. No, I can't tell you how important this conversation is, Jim. Within the Canadian construct, right? We see a lot of, and you and I were talking about this earlier, baby boomers that would love the next generation to continue the business, but the next generation just isn't interested,
That's
right?
true, yeah.
Or you find an interested buyer that wants to buy an existing business, and that is They've never been in that industry before, but they have the will and the inclination to do this. So succession planning, you can never start off too early. I mean, I would say an entrepreneur, first-time startup, right? That is trying to get that seed financing in and is trying to convince a round of angel investors, maybe potential VCs. I don't think the banks would touch them with a 10-foot pole, but that first-time entrepreneur should also be having the foresight to think through, 5 years from now, do I really want to be doing this? Or have I actually moved on? And have I sold my business at an X multiple? So it's important to have a CFO that understands valuations and a CFO that understands the value of projecting that out in the future, and also an M&A firm. So tell me a little bit more about how can Portage help in succession planning?
Well, I mean, I would say the key ingredient in being successful is having a good deal team. So I think having the right people in place is absolutely critical. So, I mean, the right transaction lawyer when the time comes is really critical.
Yes.
I think really having clean financials that are going to hold up to due diligence. And then more importantly, I think is really understanding the business. And this may sound, really basic, but at the end of the day, we see a lot of businesses, we go in there and we talk to the seller and say, hey, what makes your business better than your competitor?
Yeah.
And I think after working in that business for 20, 30, 40 years, they just assume that everyone is like them and their phone rings and they get the sales. But there is something unique about every business. There's something unique, and they've carved out a space in the market, and they're unique and there's value there. And what we have to do as M&A folks is really understand the story behind it and make it appealing to a buyer. What we don't want is ambiguity. What we don't want is a story that doesn't match the data. And that's the challenge oftentimes that we face. We come into the business, we've got the accountant prepared financials, we may have some of the accounting data that's been compiled, and we're putting the puzzle together. And we're doing the best we can, but in my mind, where there could be more value is having someone like yourself come in and put your buyer shoes on and say, this is what a buyer's gonna ask, where are we today?
I love how you put that, Jim. It's important to have that narrative right out there, right? And a lot of the times a seller isn't even thinking about the narrative. They're actually literally just thinking about that stock that's sitting in the warehouse, or that customer list that they have, or what's put on those set of financials, and they're not accountants that understand whether it's a clean set of financials or not, to your point, right? They haven't even gone through the trouble of understanding what historical data is saying about potential future growth. And that is the narrative that talks through to the buyer.
Right.
The buyer is buying the business for its future potential. The buyer is buying that business for what it is today, but more so about what it can be tomorrow. And the buyer is ready to pay a premium based on that narrative, right? So I guess having that level of coaching to sellers is important. And I, for any of my clients that are not even thinking about succession planning right now, I think they need to talk to you, Jim. They need to talk to you and your team to get a better handle on what that potential could be. Right. For a lot of business owners, I think the hardest part is to realize they might not be here tomorrow to do what they're doing. And the fear of that doesn't want them to actually acknowledge that they need to do that succession planning, right? There's an emotional element attached to that more than anything else. But this is where a fractional CFO or a finance leader comes in and also becomes a part-time therapist, believe it or not.
And Bhavna, I think you made a good point there. Buyers are coming in and they're looking at the possibility. Where can they take this business? And I think that's where the seller needs someone to really sit down with them and say, you've created something fantastic, no doubt. There's value here, but how do we maximize the value? How do we showcase it, right? If you think about, showcasing your home, what can you do to stage it? What can you do to really bring out the key pieces of your house, like your kitchen, right? I look at the business no different than that. And what I mean by that is there is a secret sauce. There are very, very good elements of a business that make it better than their competitors, it's highlighting that. It's showing a buyer what they could actually create also if they do more of X or do less of Y. And that's the strategic part that oftentimes I think is missed.
Yeah.
And that's where you could come in.
Yeah.
But I guess as we conclude, what I wanted to touch on is the key points in finding the right CFO individual. Because I know you yourself, you have specialization, you've come from certain industries. What should people be looking for, when bringing someone into their business?
That's another fantastic question, Jim. A bit about myself, which I should have covered earlier on, is yes, I do bring specializations from a particular industry within financial services. Mm-hmm. But the beauty about working as a fractional CFO is that is not the only industry that I actually get to help. So it's going back to my external auditor training days. It's going back to my consulting days when I work with a bunch of different industries. To your point, understanding the business model, understanding the unique USP, the unique selling point for that business, which is in turn their value proposition essentially. And then working with the top management team. In most cases, there aren't enough people on that top management team to give the CEO or the business owner the right kind of guidance and the advice that they actually need, right? A fractional CFO can very easily be industry agnostic. The specializations that I would, as a business owner on the other end, look for, if I was wearing the other hat, it would be, how long has this person been doing what they've been doing? What are the qualifications that they have? Qualifications are important because it's the beginning of a person's journey, but a qualification also brings a lot of rigor and discipline into your work, into your thinking. My qualification as a CPA taught me that I need to be a little bit more risk averse and always remember what are the opportunities, but balance that with what are the risks that are coming with that particular business opportunity, right? So, and it's the same thing that works at Portage as well. You have an amazing set of valuation experts that are honed in valuation methodologies, right? Across industries. Right. So and finally, I would say the one important thing is a people fit and a personality fit. That is so important. You can have the qualifications, you can have the right expertise, you can have the right years of expertise as well, but if it isn't a personality fit, then it's not going to work.
Well, it's like hiring someone for your leadership team, right? And then you want to make sure they can plug in.
Absolutely. Or it's like dating.
So at the end of the day, if I'm a business owner and I'm looking to hire a fractional CFO, obviously looking at their background, where they've come, industries they've focused on, have a conversation, make sure that there's a good fit personality-wise.
Yeah.
Anything else you can think of?
And, it is just surrounding, the finance leader needs to be a trusted business advisor, right? And trust is not something you can get in that first meeting. But I'm a big believer of, and a lot of us do that, right? By the end of that first meeting, you know whether you want to work with that person or you don't want to work with that person. So leveraging on your instincts as well. It sounds very counterintuitive because we're data-driven people and we're very numbers-focused. But, in addition to everything else that you just mentioned, Jim, I think relying on instinct is very important as well. And it also depends on where the organization thinks their business is heading. So you're looking for that right fractional CFO or interim CFO fit, given, are you expanding? Are you growing? Are you thinking of world domination? Or are you happy to keep puttering the way you are right now? Or the reverse end of that spectrum, you think you need to have an exit and you need to have a plan to know how are you going to exit. So depending upon where you think your business is headed, get the right size fit with a finance person who's had that business acumen and can guide you appropriately.
Perfect. And, I could go on for hours. I really do want to thank you, Bhavna, for joining me today in this discussion. I think it's so valuable for individuals who, really are trying to manage their business in this uncertain time. Thank you very much for coming in. I know there'll be a part two. If folks are looking to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
Okay. Firstly, thank you so much for having me over, Jim. The honor was all mine. Absolute privilege to get into such a candid conversation with you. Best way to reach me is probably LinkedIn, Bhavna Duggal on LinkedIn, and I'm also with the CFO Center of Canada, so look up the CFO Center of Canada and you'll find not me, but a whole host of really capable finance leaders on that platform as well. And Jim, another great way to get hold of me is through Portage. So thank you for having me over.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you'd like to contact me, you can find me on LinkedIn or you can send me an email at jim.friesen@portagemaadvisory.com. Please remember to like or subscribe to keep this podcast handy, and we'll see you next time.